All right, I think we're going to go ahead and get started, everyone. I'm Kathy Palmer, the Executive Director for the Travel and Tourism Research Association. Welcome to today's webinar, Understanding the Benefits of Short-Term Rentals for Destination Managers, presented by our TTRA partner, AirDNA. TTRA unites university academics, professional practitioners, and research experts, the best and the brightest from the travel and tourism research community. If you're not a member, I encourage you to join us. You can learn more at TTRA.com. Be sure to follow us on social media and visit the TTRA website for information about upcoming webinars and conferences. Before I introduce today's guest speaker, I want to remind everyone that we're using the Zoom webinar platform, so please drop your questions into the Q&A and we'll get to as many as we can at the end of the session. Today's speakers are Jamie Lane, VP of Research at AirDNA, Bram Gallagher, economist at AirDNA, Kellen Cruz, head of Tourism Solutions AirDNA, who's also speaking at the Marketing Outlook Forum on February 7th at 2:30 in the accommodations, hotels, short-term rentals, vacation homes, and more. And Adam Sachs, president of Tourism Economics, who is also speaking at the Marketing Outlook Forum on Monday, February 6th as our opening keynote speaker at 1:30. And Adam will be talking about recovery and risks for the travel industry. I'll drop the registration link for the Marketing Outlook Forum in the chat. If you aren't registered, please do so and join us in Houston in February. And now I'm going to turn it over to Kellen.
Thank you, Kathy. And thank you, everybody, for joining. So today, we're glad to have you. As you all know, paid lodging has drastically changed in recent years, and destinations have had to quickly adapt to this transformation. In 2019, I know that's going back a long ways at this point, but pre-COVID, before that had reared its ugly head, STRs had already reached record levels of supply and demand across the US and the world. The pandemic amplified those changes in traveler preferences. We'd already started to see guests looking for accommodations that offer more amenities with bigger spaces in markets and neighborhoods that haven't typically matched demand with nearby supply. Therein lies the problem. And here we are today with the hot topic of regulation. So as we emerge out of the pandemic, many questions still remain about STRs. What's the real impact of short-term rentals on your destination? When are regulations needed? What can we learn from existing and current regulations that are already in place? And is there a fine line between regulations that cause more harm than good? We'll capture all of these topics and more here today. So I'm thrilled to be here and be joined by Adam Sachs, you all know, Jamie Lane, VP of Research, and Bram Gallagher, who's an economist and new joiner to AirDNA. And just a couple of topics we'll hit on: the latest research on STRs as they relate to the housing market, how to think about short-term rentals when they're framed as the scapegoat for a housing crisis, key findings on specific STR restrictions in 10 destinations, and lastly, the latest research on the advocacy scorecard, which arms destination managers with an approach to regulation in your market. We'd love your audience participation, and so feel free to fire away with questions, and Kathy will feed those to me at the end, and we'll address all of those at the end of the panel. Jamie, let's.
Yeah, so just a brief overview on AirDNA. So we collect data on the global short-term rental industry. We've been doing it since 2016 or 2014, so long time series of data. We look at, and actively there's more than 12,000 short-term rentals out there today, over 1.5 million in the US. And we collect our data through a variety of different ways. One through user contributed data, so individual hosts directly connected and sharing that data with us. Data partners sort of providing us like channel managers and property management systems where they provide us their performance data of properties using their systems, and then through scraping. So we're looking at every listing on Airbnb, Vrbo, and Booking.com, movements in their calendar to track demand, the rates they're listed at to track the revenue that they're generating. And all that data is going to feed into some of the trends I talked through at the beginning, and broadly feed into our products for DMOs and destination managers. So broadly, I'm talking about short-term rentals, and Bram will get into some of the impacts on housing, but there's been really strong growth of supply in short-term rentals, and that's especially in the past year has led to a lot of pushback with the sort of rising housing prices and how much supply we've seen come into the market. Some numbers behind it: we're now at 1.375 million available short-term rental listings as of this summer, which was up 23% year over year. Important to note here is that when we go back to 2019, there was 1.25 million listings. So over the 3-year period, we've only seen growth of about 10%. What's happened, though, is we've seen a shift of where that supply is located, where there's been a major reduction in supply in urban areas throughout the US, on average down about 20%, and really strong growth in supply in small city rural areas, mountain resort areas, coastal resorts, sort of mid-sized cities. A lot of the areas where short-term rentals and maybe weren't in the past, or had really strong demand throughout the pandemic, of areas where people were willing and able to travel to. One thing I found really interesting is we now have more short-term rentals today, over almost 250,000 in small city rural areas, which is now significantly more than we have in urban or suburban areas around the country, which just wasn't the case in 2018, 2019, where sort of those urban suburban listings far outpaced small city rural areas. And that has changed a lot of the dynamics in some of these areas, which in the past maybe were declining areas around the country that have seen resurgence in interest as people were looking to travel to less dense areas. And what's been really encouraging for me is that demand has maintained throughout 2022. So we've now seen consistent demand growth in those small city rural areas, even this year compared to last year, which is up almost 80% compared to 2019 levels. So really spreading out demand across the country, adding tourism dollars in areas that maybe hadn't seen it in the past, and specifically going to areas that maybe couldn't support full-time or purpose-built hotels, and with the shifting supply of short-term rentals and be able to add supply quickly, we have seen that supply grow. When we look at short-term rentals relative to hotels, we actually did a big study with STR earlier this year, and what we see is over the past 5 years, we've seen short-term rental demand as a percent of total paid accommodated demand continue to grow. It was growing at a pretty significant rate from 2018, where it was just 8% of total demand, up to the start of the pandemic, when it was up over 12%, and then really accelerated throughout the pandemic. We haven't kept on that same trend. We have come back down essentially to pre-pandemic share of supply as of the early 2021, and have been growing, albeit at about half the growth rate. So over the past year, short-term rentals have gained share of about 1%, where pre-pandemic they were gaining share about 2% a year.
Jay, do you mind if I cut in? Go back to that slide just for a second.
Yeah.
Just for the viewers. So just so I understand this chart correctly. So we've combined AirDNA data with Smith Travel Research data to look at the overall share of short-term rentals to overall accommodations. Is that correct?
Yep.
And so we're seeing that's leveled off a bit. So we peaked in 2020 at about 17.5%, and now we're at 14.5%. Do you have any kind of prognostication and maybe you'll get into this in the future slides, but how this differs by location and kind of what we should be thinking about as destinations going into 2023 and 2024?
Yeah, so that big spike was more from people avoiding hotels than really pushing towards short-term rentals. It wasn't until the back half of 2020 and into 2021 that short-term rental demand really started accelerating, to the extent that in April 2021, short-term rentals had fully recovered demand back to 2020 or 2019 levels, where hotels it took until this year. That said, short-term rentals, as we mentioned earlier, saw a big decrease in supply in 2020 and 2021, as a lot of homeowners that had been renting pulled back, and a lot of supply in many of the urban areas pulled out as well. So that reduced the ability of short-term rentals to accommodate. The big supply growth recently has allowed those share gains to continue to grow. You can look at sort of demand index to 2019 levels for both hotels and short-term rentals, where essentially all location types for hotels were back to 2019 levels as of this summer. All except urban areas were well above 2019 levels for short-term rentals. So we saw much bigger shifts in demand and share gains for mid-sized cities, mountain resorts, small city rural areas. And we actually gave up share in urban areas where hotels with their fixed assets, maybe if they could have converted them to other uses, would have. And then this sort of shows those share gains. So we've broken it out by location type, and we broke it out by size of the hotel market. So in, you see here the sort of mountain coastal resorts, sort of big share gains, mostly in sort of small hotel markets where there are the big gains, as a whole lot of new short-term rental supply was able to be added, and hotels actually gained share in both the urban locations and in the top 25 markets for which there's obvious overlap. When we actually look at it on a city level, so these are the cities on the left with the most net gain in demand. So listing nights accommodated for short-term rentals. And you see that relative to hotels. So Gatlinburg, Pigeon Forge, some of the biggest gains in shares, demand share. So 750,000 more nights stayed, where there's actually less hotel stays over that same period in that market. And likewise, hotels actually did have some areas with pretty big share gains. Example is a city like Nashville, which saw over 500,000 more nights stayed. And short-term rentals actually had a decrease in demand over that period. A lot of that related to new regulations put in place in the Nashville market. So when we think about regulation and we think about and some of the pushback that we've seen towards short-term rentals, and broadly short-term rentals, and as a short-term rental investor, you want to see regulation, but not unfair or oppressive regulation. So registering, abiding by rules, making it clear who's operating these, who to call if there's a problem. And we've seen is great regulation that's been added into many markets. In many areas, there's a really high percent of short-term rentals relative to housing stock. And most of these are sort of destination markets. So like Rosemary Beach in Florida, Breckenridge, Telluride, Gatlinburg, Pigeon Forge. And these are areas where short-term rentals are traditionally used to house tourists. And it's sort of duh, like these are markets where short-term rentals are going to have a high percent, but also admittedly where areas have and a lack of affordable housing, and that there needs to be clear understanding of the types of housing that can and should be used for short-term rentals.
A quick question on how we calculate housing stock. So the numerator is obviously the percentage that are short-term rental homes, and is the denominator all single family and multifamily apartments and homes, or is it just
it's the entire housing stock as reported by the census, so it include all single family and multifamily homes.
Excellent, thanks.
And then on the flip side, so this first one was markets with the greatest share of the homes in the short-term rental stock, and then here's some of the smallest ones. So and I probably should have added an extra decimal here. So that's 0.2% of the housing stock is being used as a short-term rental in areas like Minneapolis, Chicago, Milwaukee, Cleveland, Sacramento. So a very small percent of overall listings. But maybe what's not as important as the total percent, it's understanding what's already vacant in these markets. So there's a large percent, I think it's like 17 million homes currently vacant in the US. And a large percent of those are what is considered seasonally, recreational, occasionally vacant. So essentially they're second homes for someone to use as a home occasionally. So what we've done in the scatter plot is looked at the on the vertical axis, you have the vacant percent of total housing units. So, and what we see here is just mountain resort markets. So what percent of the total housing stock is vacant, i.e. does not have a permanent resident? And then on the horizontal axis, you have that same percentage that we looked at before of short-term rentals as a percent of total housing units. And what I've done is I've broken it up into 4 quadrants, where in the top left, you have a high housing vacancy and low STR usage. In the top right, you have high housing vacancy and high STR usage. Then bottom right, you've got low housing vacancy, high STR usage. And then the bottom left, low vacancy, low STR usage. So those markets in the top left, we have a lot of people that have seasonal homes. It's more than likely underutilized housing stock. So it's people that are maybe using it just 2 weeks during the year. And where we don't see a large percent in the STR industry are being rented out. And there's a lot of opportunity in these type of markets to make better use of those homes for while they're sitting vacant, that they could be used as a short-term rental to attract tourism dollars to that market. On the top right, and those are markets generally where there's already high vacancy, there's a high percent on there. There's probably more opportunity there. And then we don't see many markets on the bottom right, but these are maybe ones you could argue where there's maybe too much short-term rentals relative to long-term housing. And then bottom left, probably not that big of an issue, or that there's sort of regulation that's sort of holding back STR usage or and vacant housing stock. We did the same thing with.
So sorry to butt in. So on that chart, if we were to kind of simplify this a bit, and you alluded to it a little bit, if we were thinking about areas on the upper top left, these might be areas that could be overregulated. where maybe you'd want to ease up the regulations to kind of meet the market and housing need, whereas the bottom right, as you mentioned, might be an area where more regulation could perhaps make the market a little bit more, I guess, palatable. Is that correct?
Yeah, and then in the colors, we actually see the I know of the percent of the vacant homes, what percent of those are sort of seasonally vacant. So those in the dark colors are ones where already and the homes are vacant and most of it's being used seasonally. So yeah, to the left, top left, in dark, those are ones where there's probably prime opportunity to maybe loosen regulation and try to bring in better utilization of those homes.
And just a spoiler alert, we'll get to Coachella Valley because that'll kind of be the part of the thesis of Adam's presentation at the end.
So same thing we did with coastal destinations, many of the same takeaways. There's quite a few in that sort of top left, not many in the right here or in the bottom right. And then we also did it with sort of some of the 50 largest cities in the US. And here we see some really interesting trends. And one thing to notice too is the scale. So on the horizontal scale, that one there is 1% of housing units are being used as short-term rentals. So you see there's only 5 markets here that have over 1%. And then the 3 in the top right, very much leisure-oriented markets, Fort Lauderdale, Miami, New Orleans, sort of urban leisure markets, Nashville and Austin, 2 markets that have seen significant new regulation come in place in relation to short-term rentals. And then on the top left, Phoenix, Scottsdale, one that has also seen significant regulation be in place, but and still high percent of seasonally vacant homes. And then the vast majority of cities sort of in the bottom left were not a high percent of short-term rentals, not a high percent of vacant housing anyway. And then sort of last 2 slides that I have is, and the other thing to look at in understanding sort of regulation in your market on its potential impact, and I know Adam will get into it, is your city and your destination's overall dependency on leisure and hospitality. And no need probably to tell this crowd about that, but for a lot of areas, it's a very high percent. And in relation to short-term rentals, a lot of times there's just not the stock of traditional hotels to house those guests. So this is just an example in my backyard in East Atlanta, Decatur area, where you see there's, and if someone wanted to stay in that area, there are 12 hotel options, of which I think only 5 I would feel comfortable having someone stay in, compared to the sort of 7,000 short-term rentals spread out throughout. And this is more residential areas and some very strong demand drivers. So there are lots of reasons why you'd want to stay in a short-term rental outside of visiting somewhere for tourism recreation. So we have a big hospital system in Atlanta that drives a lot of mid to long-term stays. Universities which have internships, semesters where people are looking for short-term housing, and we see that happening in the short-term rental demand today, where and consistently since the start of the pandemic, we've seen more than 20% of nights being booked through Airbnb as long-term stays or for 28 days or more. Most of those long-term stays are happening in urban areas. So urban, mid-size, suburban areas are where the majority of those long-term stays are happening. And as sort of a real-time example and of the popularity of flexible accommodation, Airbnb just today announced their Airbnb friendly apartments program, where you can find apartments that are STR friendly, where you can take a long-term lease and have the flexibility to rent it out on a short-term basis when you're traveling, when you're going to be away, and as a source of extra income. With that, we'll maybe jump over to Bram.
Thanks, Jamie. Yeah, I'm Bram Gallagher. I'm an economist for AirDNA. I've actually joined recently. I've spent the last 7 years looking at hospitality data, mostly at the hotel sector with CBRE, a large commercial real estate firm. But I joined up because I love working with Jamie so much. I really wanted to figure this out. And he asked me, what do you think the effect of short-term rentals is on the housing market, housing prices, rental rates? And I've only recently started. I'm not an expert in short-term rentals. I haven't done a lot of original research. So what I've done is I've tried to read essentially every existing study, academics and otherwise, that has looked at this particular question. And there has been some interest, and there has been some a growing body of literature that does look at this in several different ways. So I was pleased to be able to do that. As we go through this too, that paper will be released at some point. I'm sure all of you can get a copy, and it has the complete bibliography and all that. So if I do a lot of name dropping, don't worry, we've got all those references. So we've heard a lot about the effect of Airbnb on housing prices. I think one of the reasons for that is that we have seen this really long secular increase in housing prices since the bottom of the Great Recession. And at the same time, we've also seen Airbnbs and other short-term rentals increase pretty dramatically. So, we've got this sort of rough correlation, though. Eyeballing it from here, generally speaking, they're both going up, but there are certainly at times at which short-term rentals are declining rapidly, even as housing prices are going up. I think most notably at the beginning of the pandemic, we saw short-term rentals crashing pretty quickly, along with hotels and other hospitality expenditure, even as home prices were accelerating rapidly. So if we want to peel back the layer, if we go to the next slide, a way that this was framed since the beginning, how this association maybe got started, is because of regulations that ended up in New York, a very famously expensive housing market. They passed some pretty strict regulation before pretty much any of these studies were actually written, before we had a really good idea. But the idea was that we're going to try to help out housing price any way we can. So outlawing these Airbnbs in certain cases is going to be one way to do that. Shepard and Udall, this is a seminal paper, perhaps the first really robust examination of this question. And it did look at New York to actually see if there was the effect. And they did find one, and it was a pretty significant effect. So they said that, all right, well, we doubled STR in New York in the years prior to 2016, and this probably led to a 6 to 11% increase in the housing prices for the properties in the immediate vicinity of those short-term rentals. So, this is a pretty significant effect, and this was sort of the first paper, and this is kind of how the conversation was framed from the beginning. About the relationship of short-term rentals and housing prices. If we go to the next slide, it's something important to look at. The regulation was passed before this study came out with the assumption that the effect of short-term rentals would be to raise housing prices. When Shepard and Udall looked at it, they were agnostic as to the direction, because they thought there could be negative and positive effects on prices, and they weren't sure which were going to balance out. So I've got them summarized up here. Why would Airbnb impact prices positively? Well, you've got the option to rent your home, and that's valuable. That's a new income stream. That's one. You're going to have this increase in population demanding space. So, if you've got the capacity for tourism, you're going to increase tourism. That was something that they thought of. you're going to have that economic impact. I'm sure all the DMOs understand economic impacts of tourism very well, and that of course could increase housing prices perhaps as it buoys the entire local economy. And they had this other argument here that there are negative externalities that could lower housing prices. So crime could increase. You could have too much traffic. You could have all these negative externalities. So they were agnostic as to which direction that they would go into. But they did find, and every subsequent study also found, that the positives certainly outweighed the negatives. But one thing that Shepard and Udall did not control for, and this is a very important factor when looking at tourism, when looking at travel, is the popularity of a destination changing over time. That's something that they couldn't control for. So this gave rise to a second wave of papers. And what they did is they looked at the effect of regulation before and after. So they said, well, the immediate before and immediate after is going to be so close together in time that the only reason that prices would change, we could think, would be the enacting of that regulation and the immediate drop that you would see in the short-term rentals. So this was how they were going to control for popularity of destinations, of some places becoming hot, of some places becoming more interesting to travelers, perhaps due to the work of DMOs, promoting those destinations or for whatever other reasons. And these still found that positive effect. However, that effect, it shrunk dramatically from 6 to say 10%. Now we're looking more at maybe 2% or 3%. If you look at, and these were done in many different cities that had a large proportion of short-term rentals relative to their urbanity or the size of these places. So Barcelona, it's a big place for short-term rentals. LA as well. New Orleans, as we saw earlier, it's in that top right quadrant. And Lisbon, this was a very interesting study as well. It did see that there's 8% of the house, or 8% increase in the appreciation of these houses, but that's over this period, 70% is the actual amount that they increased. So it was a small percentage of the total increase. So what they've concluded since the Shepard and Udall paper is that yes, we do have a positive effect. However, it is much smaller. And when we're looking at these individual cities, we usually find that it's localized, particularly within very touristic and higher income areas. And if we looked at national studies, there was another branch of literature that looked at entire nations. And these studies couldn't find the effects, probably because if you take an entire nation, you're really diluting a lot of these highly touristic areas, these high income areas, dense urban cities, with very limited ability to expand housing supply or hospitality supply for that matter, where these effects are concentrated. So if you spread it out, it's very difficult to find this effect. There was a paper that started out, Baron Kung and Proserpio. It was about the same time as the Shepard and Udall in its development, and it found a similarly sized effect, but all of the later studies that looked at nations, including the US, Australia, and France, they didn't find these large effects. Interesting, the Ayuba paper looked at 15 French cities, but only Paris was the one that had a significant effect, perhaps the most touristic and most urban and expensive of all the French cities that they looked at. So this sort of correlated with some of the earlier findings as well. So we do have this positive effect. It is small, it's measurable, and it's small, and it's not the cause, we think, of most of the appreciation in the housing stock. There are other considerations that we want to look at as well. Equity. So if we're actually concerned about the availability of housing, what we want to do is look at the marginal home buyer or the marginal renter, someone that might be prevented from living in an area if the prices were to go up. So Calder Wang, this is a paper that was written in 2021, looking at New York again, specifically with this question in mind. And we do see that when we look at the pattern of the increase in the home values and in the rents, this mostly falls on higher income renters because of where those effects are located, that highly localized spot. There are some other externality considerations as well. There's this Beckerman paper. Something that's interesting about short-term rentals is that option value is valuable to the homeowners, and it stimulates new development, therefore, as a result. So the opposite side, regulations that eliminate short-term rentals would probably discourage development. There's some other things as well, the economic impacts. We all are familiar with the economic impacts of tourism. Proserpio, who had participated in that earlier New York study, found that a huge percentage of restaurant revenue, 12% of that restaurant revenue growth in Texas was attributable to short-term rental, and that it particularly affected areas that weren't well serviced by traditional hotels, independent restaurants as well. Finally, crime has been a proposed way by which short-term rentals could negatively affect housing. And this has been looked at over and over again, and there's no real positive correlation between crime and short-term rentals. There may even be a negative correlation between crime in these two areas that were studied, Florida and Austin, with the exception of one particular type, that is shared living spaces. So if you're housing, say, 6 or so people in bunk beds, then this could in fact be associated with slightly higher crime rates. But of course, this is a very, very small proportion of overall short-term rentals, less than 1%, as Jamie would say. So if we go on to this last slide, to broadly summarize, I did find an effect. So we looked at New York originally. We found a pretty moderately sized effect, significant effect, 6 to 10%. However, all the subsequent studies that tried to control for the popularity of these destinations found a much smaller effect. We found it localized, especially in touristic areas, the top quintile of homes, the very high income areas. So it's the conclusion, the broad conclusion I've drawn from the literature, that STR regulation probably not a good instrument to increase housing availability, especially for that marginal homeowner or low income renter. It's just not a big enough overlap between the effects that we see and the types of housing that these people need. There are also benefits that come out of this. It certainly exists the existing homeowners. So home prices, we don't generally want to lower home prices, right? We could go out and commit crimes in our neighborhood to lower our home prices if we wanted to have affordability, but this is probably not what we'd like to do. So their STRs do provide a benefit to those existing homeowners in that option. And there's external benefits as well, drawing in tourism, that economic impact and that tax revenue, which is of course very important to local governments. We also haven't found strong evidence of negative externalities yet, like crime or increased traffic that are particular to STR. So that's the research that I found. And with that, I think Adam Sachs has got some things to add to.
Before we jump to Adam, Graham, that was great. I think blending this to academic research is really interesting to many of us. Was there anything surprising that jumped out at you? And it's fine if your kind of summary analysis hit on it. No, not going to put you on the spot, but anything particularly being new to the industry surprise you?
Well, one of the things is when I saw all the examinations of the cities, they are in the studies that I've seen so far are in primarily those urban cities that are visited a lot by tourists and are pretty wealthy, generally speaking. Barcelona, New York, to some extent LA. So these are popular touristic cities, and they found that even within those, there's certain locations within those. So that was kind of interesting to me that even within these broader areas that are described that way, it's actually subsections within these areas that are most affected, if affected at all.
That's great. So location matters.
It's extremely important. Yes.
But right, Adam, we'll kick it to you. You're up.
Fantastic. Thanks, Kellen. While these other presentations were going on, I did a little bit of work. and I wanted to share the work I did while everyone else was giving the presentations, because the market share question is an important one. It actually had me wondering whether hotel room demand has begun to lag the economy as short-term rentals have increased share of overall lodging demand. And so I went ahead and put this together. And in fact, what we're seeing is, especially if you factor in kind of where we see things converging with the US economy going into recession in 2023, that hotel room demand has been keeping track with GDP pretty carefully. Of course, COVID had quite an effect on hotel room demand that you see here, but it's coming back. Here's the point in time we're in right now. What's interesting about it is that hotel room demand is fully recovered as of September of this year, according to STR, and it's on its way to converging back with GDP as we are forecasting over the coming year and a half. So I think what that would show us is that there's no evident degree to which STRs are cutting in hotel room demand. I think we could say, instinctively, intuitively, to some degree, in the same market for overnight guests, but that it's not so affecting the hotel market that you see a decoupling of hotel demand and the economy. So whatever anyone paid for this webinar, that was extra at no additional cost. All right, but that's not what I'm not getting paid to share with you today. My focus is the analysis of policy restrictions on short-term rentals. I'm going to share with you some specifics that we came up with working with AirDNA data that I think is really interesting. First, let me share with you the reality of the environment we're working in right now. There is a lot of regulation activity right now in regard to short-term rentals, and they're in a number of different categories: full outright bans, the requirement that hosts be present during the stay, a ban on new registrations of STRs, minimum stay requirements, they have to be there for at least 30 days, for example, zoning bans in particular areas, a primary residence requirement that it's got to be the owner's primary residence, or a maximum number of rental nights. These are all different things that are on dockets all over the place. And so this is an incredibly dynamic and relevant space for the travel industry right now. We went ahead and categorized these in recent years for different destinations. The yellow cities are all California ones. But you can see it's a pretty good set and diverse set of various types of restrictions on short-term rentals. But where we got into it using AirDNA data, what we wanted to do is look at where restrictions have been put in place and look at the performance of short-term rentals in that market, both before and after that restriction was put into place, and measure the loss in the 24 months, the 2 years after the policy change took place. And we do it with two different measures. One is just the actual fall in room nights booked, but the other is adding to it any loss in market share for its competitive set. So it's one thing to say let's say it fell 10%, but it's another thing to say it fell 10% while the rest of the market increased 10%. Well, then you're down actually 20 what it would have been. And so we measure both of those and what we call the market decline, which is actually the real observable effect over 24 months. But then we add to it the market share effect. What did it lose relative to its comp set? And you can see the declines on the far right of this table are pretty significant. I mean, you're looking at 40 to over 100% decline over that period of time. And how can you be over 100% decline? It's because of the market share effect. All right. Then we went ahead and we expanded that to look at not only the spending in terms of the rental itself, but what those visitors spend in the rest of the economy, in restaurants, in shops, for transportation, and the like. And there we're getting just across this comp set over $377 million in visitor spending lost in the 24 months after these policies were put into place. So significant effects that are observable in the data when these restrictions are put into place. And then I just ranked it and showed the not only the rental, but the other visitor spending. Just to give you a sense, the rental tends to represent a little over half of total visitor spending for short-term rental visitors. All right. So what we've seen looking at the AirDNA data is that these restrictions have a real and significant effect in the 2 years after they were put into place. And this became very, very relevant when in work in Palm Springs, because there have been different restrictions that have been proposed there. In Palm Springs, the Coachella Valley in California, so just to say, short-term rentals are incredibly important. I mean, in 2020, they represented 30% of all overnight visitor spending. Right? In 2021, it was a bit less as the other traditional lodging recovered, but still 25% of spending for the overnight market. And that was $829 million and across a lot of different industries that benefited not just the accommodation sector, but food and beverage, retail, recreation, and transportation. That then flows through the economy, right? And through the supply chain, you're looking at almost $1 billion in economic impact, 989, sustaining almost 4,600 jobs and generating $122 million in state and local taxes. So this is a significant economic generator to the Coachella Valley. And then we went and put a sharper point on it because there's a specific regulation of in La Quinta that was being voted on by referendum to basically ban all short-term rentals over time, all new registrations, and so we did a deep dive on that for La Quinta, and let me just share with you a few highlights of that. In La Quinta alone, short-term rentals, and this is a city within the Coachella Valley, Greater Palm Springs, short-term rental visitor spending went from $69 million in 2018 to $143 million in 2021. Right, so it's been growing significantly and it's become a very important part of the La Quinta visitor economy. Well, the proposed changes would reduce the inventory substantially. In fact, it would reduce the number of available units from 1,200 to 400 over time. Right, and we were already seeing the effect of that in anticipation of the potential change in that registrations in the exempt areas that were being considered in the legislation were already beginning to go to a trickle, whereas the non-exempt areas were actually coming in really strong. But this is what our forecast would be just based on the natural churn within the market. So a huge decline over a relatively short period of time, which would then, just by extension, this is just arithmetic here, but it would correspond to 138,000 fewer visitors by 2025, 122,000 in 2031 versus the baseline, and of course that would be, create significant economic losses, $102 million less in 2031, and then we measured the economic impacts of that as well. 530 fewer jobs, almost $10 million in fewer taxes as well. Interestingly, that vote rejected the restriction. So if you're in the short-term rental market, it would be a win because residents actually rejected the restriction. And then a final few thoughts for you on literature review that I want to just build on what's already been shared. The first is a study that was in Harvard Business Review just about a year ago. 15 cities, 2.9 million residential permit applications. Here's the main point of this, is that an increase, a 1% increase in Airbnb listings led to a 0.8% increase in permit applications. Right? So the point is that Airbnb actually can play an important role in driving the stock of real estate, because you see it, we're seeing a causal relationship in the data in this study that you increase Airbnb listings, it actually drives additional development, and then over time, of course, that drives additional property taxes, right? And what they saw is that in an analysis of 15 cities, STR restrictions actually reduce property taxes. All right, next study was the role of short-term rentals and residential investment in kind of the opposite direction. And what they found was that over 12 months, short-term rental restrictions reduced Airbnb listings by 8.9%, and they reduced residential permits by 10.8%. So it's an inverse relationship that they analyzed in this study. But again, the point is pretty clear that short-term rentals positively affect the development of new residential units. All right. And then the last one here is actually second to last is on housing prices. Here's the point of this Oxford economics study is that short-term rentals are having almost no effect on rent prices. In fact, they found that over the period of 2014 to 2018, of the 15% increase in housing prices, 1% of that was attributable to short-term rentals. So, for example, the average annual mortgage payment would have been actually $105 cheaper if SDRs had remained at their 2014 level, or median rents would have been $2 lower in the absence of SDRs. So a small effect. All right, and then last is the question of crime. We actually did this study for Airbnb, and we built a model across it was Atlanta, Chicago, Dallas, LA, and Philly. And over those 5 cities, we actually compiled crime data, and at the census block level, so this is neighborhood level, we were able to look at whether there was any relationship with the increases in Airbnb presence and activity with crime, and actually found no effect whatsoever as we modeled this out. So confirming the hypothesis that there's no relationship between Airbnb and crime in these cities. And we did that at the neighborhood level to be as accurate as we could be. All right, so that's a quick tour, but happy to answer any questions.
That was fantastic, Adam. Clearly tourism economics is the voice of authority for a lot of folks that are looking to, do analyses like this. Aside from, hire me to help you understand this more, what kind of simple advice do you have for some of the folks on the line who work in destinations and want to understand or analyze the regulations within their market, perhaps using some data like we've shown here?
Right. I mean, some of the research that we've done, I'm happy to make available. I think that alone can be really helpful. There's data that, if they're tracking short-term rental activity, that alone, I think, can be compelling in terms of just the volume of trips and nights. But extending that out to economic impact isn't especially difficult. And so we're always happy to help lend a hand in that regard as well.
Excellent. Jamie, got a question from the audience. Wendy has always got a good one for us. Here. So is it possible that low short-term rental usage markets, like you showed on a couple of your charts, aren't being captured because homeowners are using platforms outside of Airbnb, Vrbo, to list their STRs or to rent them?
Yeah, and absolutely there's that possibility. And we know and especially mid and long-term rentals, and there's other sites that people prioritize with short-term rentals. And we've done research and others have done research that essentially 95% of operators in that system are using one of those 3 platforms to rent out in the US. So it's garnering the vast majority. We do see on the luxury end, other platforms pop up, other sort of direct listing sites, people not wanting to put their multi-million-dollar homes on Airbnb, but list it more directly with realtors or other sort of off OTA sites. But in terms of this sort of analysis where we're looking at really high level numbers, I feel like it's very representative and that it's going to be collecting most of the properties that are sort of listed are being used as a short-term rental.
Excellent. Next question, I'm going to put this up for a fly ball, probably comes to you, Jamie or Adam. Is there any evidence AirDNA has seen that business travelers are beginning to book in the short-term rental space for group instead of the traditional hotel group business space?
And yes, there's evidence. We have lots of anecdotal evidence. We have what Airbnb's publicly stated, that I think it was as late as 2018 that over 30% of their bookings happening in urban areas was for people booking business travel. They're allow for connecting your business account and sort of tracking business trips through their system. And we see, albeit less than the pandemic, but still a large amount of supply in urban areas being rented out. We're seeing more and more group travel. So companies renting out sort of larger short-term rental options. So maybe a 6, 7, 8 bedroom home for offsites of bringing groups together and for a week at a time to work on planning, to work on things that maybe would have otherwise happened in a larger group hotel or at a headquarters office. So I think the definition of work and in-office work has changed. And sort of the definition of transient accommodation is evolving too, of if you're traveling for work and then add an extra weekend and staying in a short-term rental, like, was that trip for work or leisure or some combination of in between? It's really progressing.
All right, we are at time. We nailed it on the head. If we did not get to your questions, sorry, feel free to email me, kellen@airdna.co. I will be happy to speak with the panel and get you a response. Thank you again to all of our panelists. Wonderful to see you all, and have a great rest of your week. Goodbye.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.